The Hague's Binnenhof is one of the oldest centers of power in Europe. For centuries, its halls rang with debates, laws, and politics. But in February 1943, under the boot of Nazi occupation, it had been repurposed into something darker, a place of interrogation and fear. In a second-floor chamber, bound to a chair, sat a man who should never have belonged there. His name was Gerrit Willem Kastein, a neurologist, a teacher, a husband, and in secret, a killer of Nazis. The Gestapo thought they had him cornered. They had already broken countless men in this very room. Some begged for mercy. Others tried to endure, only to scream when the torture began. For Kastein, the stakes were higher. He was not just another prisoner. He carried inside him the arteries of the Dutch resistance, names, addresses, the entire fragile web of a nation's underground fight for freedom. If he talked, the network would die. If he stayed silent, they would break his body piece by piece until it gave way. The Gestapo thought the dilemma would destroy him, but Kastein saw another path. His eyes fell on the window, a tall frame of glass, 2 stories above a stone courtyard. To most men, it meant only certain death, but to Kastein, it meant salvation, not for himself, but for everyone he could protect by leaping. There was no hesitation, no bargains whispered in his mind. The decision was already written in him. He rose, ran, and hurled his bound body through the glass. The shatter tore through the stillness of the Binnenhof. Guards shouted, boots thundered down the stairwell. But by the time they reached the courtyard, Kastein lay crumpled and broken, his blood already seeping between the cobblestones. He had denied them their victory. He had denied them their prize. And in his final act of defiance, Gerrit Kastein had saved countless others. But to understand this leap, to understand the man who chose death over betrayal, we must rewind. We must return to the beginning of his journey, to Zutphen, where he was born in 1910, to his studies in Groningen and Heidelberg, where he became a brilliant neurologist, to the political passions that burned in him when fascism began its march across Europe, to Spain, where he served as a doctor in a war that was meant to stop Hitler before he began. We must see how a man trained to heal became a man willing to kill, how he rose to lead the CS6 resistance cell, a group so feared by the Nazis that their very name came to symbolize death in occupied Amsterdam, and how his strikes against the Reich, the assassination of General Seifert, the attack on Raiden, pushed the occupation into chaos and triggered brutal reprisals. The prologue ends where it began, at the window, because Gerrit Kastein's final act is only understood when you know what he was willing to sacrifice, and why. This is the story of the Dutch doctor, who lived 2 lives, by day, a healer, by night, the Nazis' most relentless enemy. He was born in Zutphen, in the east of the Netherlands in 1910, a town of narrow streets and Gothic spires, where life moved at the steady rhythm of small city Europe. Gerrit Willem Kastein grew up in a country that prided itself on neutrality, a place that still remembered the devastation of the First World War, yet imagined itself safely removed from the battles raging elsewhere on the continent. From an early age, though, Gerrit was different. He was sharp, restless, and driven by a curiosity that made him see the world not as it was, but as it could be. By the time he entered medical school in Groningen, he had already built a reputation for brilliance. He devoured textbooks, challenged professors, and sought answers not only in the science of the body, but in the moral questions that haunted it. What did it mean to heal? What did it mean to dedicate your life to others? Those weren't abstract questions for him, they were convictions. He had chosen neurology, the study of the human brain, as his specialty. The mind fascinated him, not just for its mysteries, but because he believed it held the key to understanding both strength and suffering. Yet the walls of the lecture halls could not keep out the storm gathering over Europe. The early 1930s brought the rise of fascism, first in Italy, then in Germany, and it quickly spread its poison across borders. Anti-Semitism, book burnings, racial laws, these weren't distant headlines. They were warning signs that the values of science, reason, and human dignity could be torn apart in months. Kastein, still in his 20s, felt the tension as though it were carved into his own skin. Where others dismissed Hitler as a passing madness, Gerrit read him correctly as a threat to civilization itself. It was during this period that he deepened his political ties. He attended meetings, studied Marxist theory, and aligned himself with the Dutch Communist Party. To him, this wasn't about dogma or blind ideology, it was about resistance. He believed the only real opposition to fascism would come from those organized enough, radical enough to meet its violence with equal resolve. In this he was far ahead of many of his contemporaries, who still clung to the hope that neutrality or diplomacy could shield the Netherlands. And then came Spain. In 1936, civil war erupted there, a war that would become a testing ground for Europe's future. On one side, the Republican government, supported by international volunteers, students, workers, doctors. On the other, General Francisco Franco, backed by Hitler and Mussolini. For Kastein, there was no hesitation. He joined the medical mission to Spain, tending to the wounded under skies where German and Italian bombers honed the tactics they would soon unleash on Warsaw, Rotterdam and London. He saw fascism in its rawest form, villages shelled, civilians massacred, comrades executed. Spain radicalized him. It stripped away any illusion that fascism could be appeased or reasoned with, and it hardened him, not only as a physician, but as a man who understood the cost of inaction. He returned to the Netherlands with new scars, some visible, many hidden, and with a sharpened clarity about what was coming. Back home, he tried to resume life as a doctor and lecturer, but it never quite fit. He taught neurology, treated patients, and married. Yet beneath the white coat, he was already something else. The lectures he gave carried an urgency that unsettled his colleagues. His political activities put him under quiet surveillance. But he didn't stop. He believed knowledge was meaningless if it wasn't wielded against the brutality advancing across Europe. Then came May 1940. The sound of German bombers over Rotterdam ended centuries of Dutch neutrality in a single day. The Netherlands fell in just 5. The swastika hung over the Binnenhof, and a silence settled over Dutch streets, a silence made of fear, curfews and arrests. For many, the only option was to endure. For Gerrit Kastein, there was no question. He began as a courier, a quiet figure on a bicycle, moving messages and supplies. But his networks grew, and soon he was building connections between scattered cells. His training as a doctor gave him the perfect cover. Who would suspect a neurologist, respected and well-dressed, of running messages for the underground? Yet even in these early days, it was clear he was not the kind of man who would settle for leaflets and whispers. He was preparing himself, and those around him, for something far riskier. By the end of 1941, as arrests mounted and repression deepened, Gerrit Kastein was already on the path to becoming more than a doctor, more than a courier, more than even a political agitator. He was becoming what the Nazis feared most, an organizer with nothing left to lose, and the will to fight them on their own terms. The oath he had once taken, to preserve life, had not disappeared, but in his mind it had transformed. Preserving life now meant ending tyranny, even if that required taking lives to do so. This was the making of a resistor. The German occupation tightened its grip on the Netherlands like a vice. At first, many Dutch citizens told themselves they could adapt, that life would continue under new rulers so long as they stayed quiet. Shops opened, trams ran. Doctors like Gerrit Kastein still saw patients. On the surface, daily life stumbled forward. But beneath that surface, the weight of the Reich pressed down harder with each month. Everywhere, reminders of submission appeared. German soldiers patrolling the streets in grey uniforms, loudspeakers blaring Nazi decrees, ration cards controlling even the smallest meals. Jewish families were pushed into corners of cities, stripped of jobs, then property, then freedom. One by one, friends and neighbors disappeared behind barbed wire and into cattle cars bound for the east. The silence of Dutch streets became unbearable. For Kastein, the time of hesitation was over. He slipped fully into resistance, no longer balancing medicine and politics as separate lives, but fusing them into one mission. His knowledge of human behavior, His ability to organize and his deep ideological conviction made him invaluable to the underground. At first, his role was small, relaying forbidden newspapers, coordinating safe houses, helping Jews find routes to escape arrest. But by 1941, he had become more than a courier. He was a strategist. The Nazis soon took notice. In November 1941, the Gestapo struck. Kastein was arrested for his communist activities and imprisoned. For many, this would have been the end. A cell, interrogation, execution, but he was cunning. He managed to escape custody, slipping through the cracks of a system that believed it had already crushed him. That escape would change everything. Once free, he went into hiding, but not passively. He set about binding together what was still scattered. Small groups of resistors, disconnected cells, young idealists who burned with anger, but lacked coordination. Gerrit Kastein provided that link. He became a bridge, not just carrying messages, but creating networks. His focus sharpened on the work that mattered most, intelligence and sabotage. Through his connections, photographs of German fortifications along the Dutch coast were smuggled to London. Details of troop movements and logistical plans made their way to Allied ears, and still, he pressed further. If the occupation taught him anything, it was that information alone would not stop the Reich. Words and whispers were not enough. It was here that his path darkened. Kastein was a doctor by training, a healer by profession. Yet in the streets of occupied Amsterdam and The Hague, he began to prepare himself and those around him for a different kind of struggle, one where syringes and scalpels would be replaced by pistols and grenades. The moral shift was not simple, but it was, to him, necessary. Each day, collaborators helped the Germans tighten their grip. Each week, more names were added to lists of arrests. He had seen what fascism did in Spain, and now he watched it consume his own homeland. To remain a doctor who healed bodies while the body of his country bled out, that for him was the greater betrayal. So he embraced the resistance with a new intensity. No longer just a courier, no longer just a messenger. Gerrit Kastein had become a fighter, and the fighter was about to find his battleground, a small, secretive group of radicals in Amsterdam. They would call themselves CS6, and together they would make Nazi collaborators tremble in their own homes. This was the beginning of his transformation from healer to hunter, the point where the man who once studied the fragile mysteries of the human mind turned his own into a weapon of war. Amsterdam, 1942. A city under occupation, its canals darkened by curfews, its streets echoing with the boots of German patrols. For most, fear meant silence. But for a few, fear was a challenge, and it was here, on a quiet residential street, in a modest house at Corellestraat 6, that Gerrit Kastein found his new home in the resistance. The house itself looked ordinary. Families passed it daily, never guessing what was hidden inside. But behind those walls, a small circle of men and women were plotting something few others dared to imagine: the systematic assassination of Nazi collaborators. They would become known simply as CS6, named after their address. And though they were small in number, students, doctors, poets, radicals, their impact would send tremors through the highest ranks of the Reich in the Netherlands. The seeds of CS6. The group formed organically, not as a military unit, but as a gathering of like-minded individuals pushed to extremes. There were the Boissevain brothers, part of a prominent Amsterdam family, who used their resources and connections to support the underground. There was Jan Verloon, a fiery student whose youthful energy matched Kastein's steel determination. And there was Reina Prinsen Geerligs, a young woman whose quiet resolve would make her one of the most remarkable figures of Dutch resistance. What united them was not training, few had any, but conviction. They had watched the occupation grow bolder, deportations of Jews, forced labor, the suffocation of Dutch universities, the tightening noose of collaboration. To them, leaflets and whispers felt like a whisper against a storm. They needed something louder, something that would make collaborators fear the very act of opening their front doors. Kastein, with his sharp mind and calm discipline, quickly rose within the group. He was no longer just the neurologist who had treated patients, or the courier who carried messages. He became the strategist, the planner who turned anger into action. His medical training gave him an unusual advantage: precision. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns, ways to strike and survive. To him, the group was like a body, each member a vital organ, each action a heartbeat. His role was to keep that body alive while directing its blows at the enemy. He taught them discipline, the importance of secrecy, the art of compartmentalization. No one should ever know more than they needed to, because one arrest could unravel everything. Yet he also knew that secrecy alone would not stop the occupation. So CS6 escalated. Their mission shifted from propaganda and intelligence to direct action, assassination. For some in the resistance, assassination was a step too far. It risked brutal reprisals, collective punishment, the deaths of innocents. But for Kastein and CS6, the logic was clear. Nazi rule depended not only on German soldiers, but on Dutch collaborators, men who betrayed neighbors, enforced decrees, and paved the way for mass deportations. Remove those men, and the machinery of occupation might falter. And so the doctor, who once pledged to heal, now sanctioned killing as a form of cure. In his eyes, each collaborator struck down was not just one life ended, but countless lives preserved, lives that might otherwise vanish into camps and firing squads. It was a dark calculus. But in war, he believed morality had to be sharpened into action. The danger was constant. By day, Kastein moved through Amsterdam with the air of a doctor, quiet, respectable, unassuming. By night, he attended meetings in shadowed rooms, drew maps of targets, and weighed the risks of pulling a trigger in the middle of a crowded street. Every movement had to be calculated. A bicycle leaned too long against a wall could be a signal to the Gestapo. A letter carried in the wrong pocket could condemn not only him but everyone connected to him. The walls of CS6's safe house held both their plans and their fears, the weight of knowing that at any moment betrayal could shatter them. Yet within that house, there was also a strange kind of hope. They laughed, argued, dreamed of a Netherlands free again. They were young, most of them in their 20s. For all the danger, they lived with an intensity that peace had never offered. By late 1942, CS6 had grown bold enough to target the most visible symbols of collaboration. They scouted officials, memorized routines, and rehearsed their attacks. The sound of a pistol shot in a quiet street would soon become their signature. Their philosophy was surgical: strike quickly, disappear, leave behind the silence of fear. For Kastein, it was not unlike neurosurgery. Every move had to be precise, every risk carefully weighed. One slip, and the consequences could be catastrophic. It was in this crucible that they began planning their most audacious operations, killings that would echo through Nazi command and draw the full wrath of the occupation down upon them. As 1943 dawned, the doctor had completed his transformation. Gerrit Kastein still carried the knowledge of healing in his hands, but he had chosen to wield them differently. To him, killing collaborators was not betrayal of his oath, but its extension, a desperate form of triage for a dying nation. He was no longer just a doctor. He was the architect of a resistance cell, whose name the Nazis would soon curse. And the strike that would make them infamous was already in motion. A general of the Dutch SS was about to hear a knock at his door. Rationing, deportations, forced labor, all imposed with cold efficiency. But early that year, a new decree struck like a thunderbolt. In February, Berlin announced the creation of the Gemachtigden van der Leider, a shadow government designed to turn the Dutch into tools for Hitler's war machine. It meant compulsory labor service for Dutch men, conscription into German-controlled battalions, and the further stripping away of what little independence remained. For many, it was a humiliation. For the resistance, it was a call to arms. For Gerrit Kastein and the cell at CS6, it was the proof they needed that waiting, whispering, and distributing leaflets were no longer enough. The occupation would not simply grind to a halt, it had to be disrupted, and the clearest way to disrupt it was to sever its leaders. Among the new order's most visible faces was Lieutenant General Hendrik Alexander Seifert, a retired officer who had allied himself openly with Anton Mussert and the Dutch Nazi Party. He had lent his prestige as a respected general to legitimize the Waffen-SS's Dutch Volunteer Corps, urging young men to enlist and die on the Eastern Front for Hitler. To CS6, Seifert was more than a symbol, he was an enabler. His words had already sent thousands of Dutch sons to the snowfields of Russia, where many never returned. He embodied the collaboration that made Nazi domination possible, and so, after tense debate, CS6 chose him as their target. Planning the assassination of a man so prominent required nerve and discipline. Kastein coordinated the effort with the precision of a surgeon. First, surveillance. Members of CS6 shadowed Seifert's routines, noting when he left his home, when he returned, who accompanied him. They charted patterns, searched for vulnerabilities, and narrowed down their options. They could not risk a public ambush. The Gestapo's response would be overwhelming. They needed something quick, intimate, and direct. The decision was made, they would go to him. 2 young members were chosen for the task, one to knock at his door, another to wait with the pistol. The rest of the group provided cover and escape. Each step was rehearsed in whispers, each movement drilled into memory. Failure was unthinkable. Kastein understood the stakes. One mistake would not only cost lives but unravel the fragile network they had built, and yet he pressed forward. To him, this was not simply about killing a man. It was about sending a message that even the most protected collaborators were vulnerable, that Dutch resistance was alive and willing to strike. On the evening of February 5, 1943, Amsterdam lay under curfew. The city was hushed, its streets patrolled by German soldiers. Yet in one quiet neighborhood, 2 figures approached the house of General Seifert. They knocked. When the general himself answered the door, they asked his name to confirm their target. Then came the shots, sharp cracks echoing in the night. Seifert collapsed in his doorway, mortally wounded. The attackers fled into the darkness, disappearing into a city already tense with fear. Inside the house, chaos erupted as servants and neighbors scrambled to help the fallen general, but it was too late. By the following day, Seifert was dead. News of the assassination spread quickly, whispered first in hushed tones, then shouted in Nazi proclamations. For ordinary Dutch citizens, it was a moment of electrifying defiance. The occupiers had seemed untouchable, their collaborators untouchable. But now one of their most visible figures lay dead in his own home, struck down by resistance fighters who had dared to act. For the Nazis, it was a humiliation and an excuse. The German authorities unleashed a wave of reprisals, arresting students, raiding universities, and executing hostages. Hundreds were rounded up, many never to return. In their fury, they aimed to crush not just CS6 but the spirit of the Dutch people themselves. Kastein knew this would happen. He had wrestled with it in the planning stages, the terrible weight of retaliation. Yet to him, the alternative was worse. Allowing Seifert to continue would have meant thousands more Dutchmen forced into Hitler's war, thousands more deaths on the Eastern Front, thousands more families broken. Violence would bring violence. But he believed in the long arc of resistance, that a single bold act could shift the balance, inspire others, and fracture the enemy's confidence. The success emboldened CS6. Just days later, on February 9th, they attempted another high-profile attack, this time targeting Hermanus Raiden, the Secretary General for Propaganda. The plan went forward, but tragedy followed. In the ambush, Raiden's wife was killed instantly, and Raiden himself was mortally wounded. The operation underscored both the power and the peril of assassination. The Nazis retaliated even more brutally, instituting widespread executions under Operation Silbertan. Innocent civilians, plucked from lists, were shot as reprisals for resistance attacks. The resistance faced a haunting question: were their strikes saving lives in the long run, or condemning innocence in the short? For Kastein, there was no turning back. He had crossed the line fully, from doctor to assassin, from healer to hunter, and though his conscience was surely burdened, his conviction never wavered. To stop was to surrender. To surrender was to betray. The Seifert operation marked both the height of CS6's power and the beginning of its unraveling. The group's audacity had drawn blood, but it had also drawn the unrelenting gaze of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi security service. Their patience for whispers was over. They wanted CS6 destroyed. For Kastein, the danger grew by the day. He moved from safe house to safe house, always looking over his shoulder, always aware that betrayal could come from anyone, a neighbor, a fellow resistor, even a comrade turned informant under pressure. And betrayal was coming. The echo of Seaford's assassination had not yet faded when CS6 struck again. Less than a week later, on February 9, 1943, the group targeted Hermanus Raiden, the Secretary General for Propaganda. Raiden had become infamous as a mouthpiece for the occupation, a man who twisted words into weapons, spreading lies that gave collaboration the mask of patriotism. The plan was as daring as the first. The attackers approached his residence, waited for the right moment, and then opened fire. But this time, fate dealt them a harsher hand. Raiden was wounded but survived. His wife, however, was struck and killed instantly. The mission, intended as a blow against propaganda, instead left a family shattered and handed the Nazis an opportunity for revenge. Hans Alban Rotter, the SS leader in the Netherlands, wasted no time. To him, Seaford's death and Raiden's wounding were not simply attacks, they were insults, challenges to his authority. And he would answer them in the only way he knew: terror. Within hours, lists of hostages were drawn up. Men already in prison, many for no crime other than being Jewish, communist or suspected of disloyalty, were marched to firing squads. Their executions were announced as retaliation, a grim arithmetic of occupation. For every bullet fired by the resistance, the Germans would answer with 10, 20, sometimes 50 lives. That something came in the form of Anton van der Waals. On the surface, van der Waals was everything the resistance wanted in a recruit. He seemed eager, courageous, and willing to risk his life for the cause. He knew how to talk the talk, dropping names of contacts, offering plausible stories of how he had slipped past German patrols, presenting himself as just another Dutchman pushed too far by Nazi rule. But beneath the mask, he was something else entirely, an informant working for the Sicherheitsdienst. To the Germans, he was invaluable. Unlike soldiers who patrolled in uniform, van der Waals could slip into rooms where trust was traded like currency. He could shake hands, share coffee, whisper solidarity, all while carrying their names back to the very enemy they thought they were fighting. He played the role with precision. He didn't rush to betray everyone at once. He dangled just enough truth to seem reliable, and just enough need to seem desperate. In a world where secrecy was survival, he mastered the art of blending in, and eventually, his path crossed with Gerrit Kastein. In February 1943, van der Waals proposed a meeting. He spoke of weapons, of contacts, of opportunities to expand CS6's reach. For a group desperate for new resources, the prospect was tempting. The resistance thrived on trust and risk in equal measure. One could never be sure, but neither could one afford to turn down every lead. Kastein, pragmatic but bold, agreed to the rendezvous. The location was a cafe in Delft called De Kroon, neutral on the surface, frequented by locals, but also easy for the Gestapo to monitor. On February 19, 1943, Kastein arrived, unaware that he was walking into a trap. The cafe was quiet, the air heavy with smoke and whispers. As Kastein entered, plainclothes SD officers closed in, guns flashed, orders barked in German. For most men, it would have ended there, captured, disarmed, and dragged into a waiting car. But Kastein was not most men. As they tried to force him into the vehicle, he fought. Bound and overpowered, he still resisted with the ferocity of a man who knew what was at stake. In the struggle, he managed to draw a hidden pistol. Shots rang out inside the car. One officer was wounded, another barely survived. For a moment, chaos reigned, a flash of possibility that he might yet break free. But the odds were impossible. He was beaten, disarmed, and subdued. Bloodied and bound, he was transported not as a prisoner to be questioned, but as a trophy to be broken. The SD had captured the man they considered one of the most dangerous resistors in the Netherlands. He was taken to The Hague, to the Binnenhof, the same place where Dutch democracy had once thrived, now converted into a fortress of interrogation. To the Germans, this was victory. They believed they had at last caught the man who masterminded assassinations that rattled their authority. They believed they would finally unravel the web of CS6. But for Gerrit Kastein, the Binnenhof was not a prison. It was a crossroads. He knew what awaited him inside: torture, interrogation, and the unrelenting demand for names. The Gestapo had broken countless men before. Some cracked quickly, others endured longer. But all of them, in time, surrendered something: a name, an address, a clue that led to another arrest. Kastein could not allow that. Not for himself, not for the network he had built. And so, even in capture, he was already making his plan. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but the essence is clear. Inside the interrogation room, he was left under guard. His hands were tied, his body bruised from the fight in Delft, yet his mind was unbroken. He saw the window, 2 stories above the courtyard, framed in heavy glass. To most it would have been a symbol of despair, the unreachable sky, the freedom just beyond grasp. To Kastein, it was opportunity. When the guards faltered, when their vigilance slipped for just a heartbeat, he acted. He hurled himself forward, charging with all the strength left in him. His bound body crashed through the glass, shards exploding into the cold air. The fall was swift, the impact devastating. Bones shattered against the cobblestones below. But in that final act, Gerrit Kastein achieved what the Gestapo feared most. He had denied them his mind. He had denied them the names, the secrets, the map of resistance that could have doomed countless others. He had chosen death, not surrender, for the Sicherheitsdienst. It was both triumph and humiliation. They had captured him, but they had not broken him. In their files, Kastein's death was reduced to an entry, a statistic, but among the resistance, his leap through the window became legend. Word spread quickly. The doctor who had become a killer had defied the Nazis to the very end. He had chosen the only freedom left to him, the freedom of refusing to betray. For many, it was both an inspiration and a tragedy. Inspiration, because it showed the depth of courage possible, even in the darkest hour. Tragedy, because it showed the price every resistor risked paying. His body was buried quietly, another casualty of war, but his memory lived on, in whispered stories, in the shaken confidence of collaborators, in the resilience of those who continued to fight. Anton van der Waals, the man who betrayed him, continued his duplicitous work for the Nazis. Dozens more would fall into his traps. He embodied the cruelty of occupation, that it wasn't always soldiers with guns, but neighbors with smiles who could destroy you. Yet in the story of Gerrit Kastein, even van der Waals fades into the background, because the betrayal, as devastating as it was, did not define him. What defined him was the choice he made in that interrogation room, the leap that turned his death into defiance. The Binnenhof stood in silence after the crash. Soldiers rushed down the stairwell, boots hammering against the ancient stone. By the time they reached the courtyard, the doctor's body lay still on the cobbles, twisted and broken, blood pooling where democracy had once been spoken aloud. They surrounded him, furious shouts echoing off the walls. But there was no victory here. The prize they had captured hours before was gone. The man who carried in his mind the arteries of the Dutch resistance had chosen a path they could neither predict nor prevent. For Gerrit Kastein, there had never been a question. He knew the Gestapo's methods. He knew how torture could break even the strongest, how silence could turn to whispers and whispers to confessions under the lash. He had seen it happen to others. And so, when the trap closed around him in Delft, when the car door slammed shut and the pistol jammed against his ribs, he must have known that his end was near. But his end would not be theirs to dictate. In his leap, he destroyed their script. He denied them the satisfaction of extracting names. He denied them the propaganda victory of parading him in court as a terrorist. He denied them the unraveling of his comrades' lives. It was not suicide born of despair. It was a final act of resistance, as deliberate as the assassinations he had planned, as precise as the surgeries he had once performed. It was his last operation, carried out with the only instrument he had left, his own body. In that moment, the doctor who once healed nerves and stitched wounds rewrote the meaning of resistance. He showed that even when every choice is stripped away, One choice remains: to break or not to break, and Gerrit Kastein did not break. The courtyard of the Binnenhof is silent now, but on that February afternoon, it echoed with the sound of glass exploding into shards. Gerrit Willem Kastein's body hit the stones with finality, his blood soaking into the ground where Dutch democracy had once stood. The Gestapo gained nothing. No names, no addresses, no confessions, only a corpse they could not bend to their will. The man who had once healed minds with his hands, who had turned those same hands to killing collaborators, chose his final act with clarity: death before betrayal. The Nazis broke many, but not him. Gerrit Willem Kastein did not break.